Maryland has a rent increase framework that combines a permissive state-level approach with increasingly active local regulations, particularly in the jurisdictions surrounding Washington, D.C. If you manage rental property in Maryland, the rules that apply to your property depend heavily on which county or city it's located in, because Maryland's local governments have been among the most active in the country when it comes to tenant protections. The governing state law is found in Maryland Code, Real Property Title 8, along with local ordinances that add substantial requirements in several jurisdictions. Maryland does not have a statewide rent cap that limits the dollar amount or percentage of a rent increase. At the state level, a landlord can technically raise the rent by any amount, provided they follow proper procedures and the increase isn't motivated by an illegal purpose. However, and this is where Maryland gets complex, the state does not have a preemption statute that prevents local governments from enacting rent regulations. This absence of preemption has allowed Maryland's counties and cities to take very different approaches, creating a patchwork of local rules that landlords must navigate. Montgomery County, one of the most affluent and populous jurisdictions in Maryland, located directly northwest of Washington, D.C., has enacted rent stabilization through its Voluntary Rent Guidelines program. Under Montgomery County's guidelines, the county publishes an annual recommended rent increase percentage, typically tied to the Consumer Price Index. While the guidelines are technically voluntary, meaning there isn't a hard legal cap with enforcement penalties for exceeding them, the guidelines carry significant practical weight. Landlords who exceed the recommended increase may face tenant complaints, scrutiny from the county's Office of Landlord-Tenant Affairs, and potential legal challenges. The county's Landlord-Tenant Office actively mediates disputes involving rent increases that exceed the guidelines. Montgomery County has also been at the forefront of discussions about converting the voluntary guidelines into mandatory rent stabilization. Proposals for a hard cap have been introduced in the county council, and the political conversation continues to evolve. Landlords in Montgomery County should stay informed about potential changes that could convert the current voluntary system into a mandatory one. Prince George's County, located directly east of D.C., has its own tenant protection framework that includes provisions affecting rent increases. The county has enacted measures that provide additional notice requirements and tenant protections beyond state law. Landlords in Prince George's County should verify the current local requirements before implementing any increase. Baltimore City has been active in tenant protection legislation as well. The city has enacted various measures aimed at addressing affordability and tenant displacement, and the political environment in Baltimore continues to generate proposals for additional regulation. While Baltimore hasn't enacted a traditional rent cap, the city's regulatory approach to landlord-tenant relations is more active than in many other parts of the state. Howard County, Anne Arundel County, and other Maryland jurisdictions have their own local approaches that may include additional notice requirements or tenant protection measures. Landlords with properties in multiple Maryland jurisdictions should verify the specific requirements in each location. For properties not subject to any local rent regulation, the statewide framework applies. For month-to-month tenancies, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Maryland requires at least 1 month's written notice, delivered at least 1 month before the next rent due date, for changes to the terms of a monthly tenancy. So if rent is due on the 1st and you want the increase to take effect on May 1st, you need to deliver written notice by April 1st at the latest. However, many local jurisdictions require longer notice periods. Montgomery County, for example, requires landlords to provide at least 60 days' notice before a rent increase. Other jurisdictions may have their own specific notice requirements. Always check the local rules before relying on the 1-month state minimum. The notice should be in writing, should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. In jurisdictions with rent guidelines or additional requirements, the notice may need to include additional information, such as the percentage of the increase, a reference to the applicable guideline, or information about the tenant's right to dispute the increase. Deliver by a documented method, personal delivery, certified mail, or another verifiable means. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term, unless the lease includes a provision allowing mid-term increases. At renewal, the landlord can propose a new rent, but in jurisdictions with rent guidelines, the increase at renewal may also be subject to the guideline. When the lease approaches expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rate well in advance, particularly in jurisdictions requiring extended notice periods. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice period for rent changes is 1 week, 7 days, under state law, though local requirements may differ. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply statewide. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Maryland has a specific anti-retaliation provision under Real Property Section 8-208.1 that prohibits landlords from raising rent in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. Protected activities include filing a rent escrow action, making a good faith complaint about habitability to the landlord or a government agency, reporting a code violation, participating in a tenant's organization, and exercising any right under Maryland landlord-tenant law. Maryland's anti-retaliation statute provides that adverse action taken within a specified period after the tenant's protected activity creates a presumption of retaliation. The landlord must then demonstrate that the increase was motivated by legitimate business factors unrelated to the tenant's complaint. A retaliatory rent increase can be invalidated, and the landlord may face liability for damages and attorney's fees. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and Maryland's own fair housing law, found in the state government article, Title 20, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, familial status, marital status, or source of income. Maryland's anti-discrimination protections are broader than the Federal Fair Housing Act. The inclusion of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, and source of income provides additional categories of protection. The source of income protection is particularly significant for rent increases. A landlord cannot raise rent specifically to push out a tenant who receives housing choice vouchers, Social Security disability, or other lawful sources of income. A rent increase that appears targeted at subsidy recipients, while other comparable tenants are not similarly affected, could result in a discrimination complaint with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. Maryland's lead paint law creates an additional consideration for rent increases. Under the Maryland Lead Risk Reduction in Housing Act, landlords of pre-1978 properties must comply with lead paint registration, inspection, and risk reduction requirements. If a landlord raises rent and a tenant raises lead paint concerns, particularly if there are young children in the unit, the landlord may face heightened scrutiny from both the tenant and regulatory agencies. Ensuring lead paint compliance before implementing rent increases on older properties protects against this exposure. Maryland also has specific provisions regarding rent increases in subsidized housing. For tenants in units receiving federal or state subsidies, rent increases must comply with the applicable program rules in addition to any local rent guidelines. The interplay between program rules and local regulations can create complex compliance requirements for landlords who participate in multiple subsidy programs. From a practical standpoint, Maryland's rental market is heavily influenced by proximity to Washington, D.C. and the federal government. The D.C. suburbs, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Howard County, and Anne Arundel County, have some of the strongest rental markets in the state, driven by federal government employment, defense contractors, healthcare, technology, and the overall economic engine of the National Capital Region. Montgomery County has the most expensive rental market in Maryland, with rents that rival the D.C. market itself. The county's proximity to the NIH, Walter Reed, the I-270 Technology Corridor, and numerous federal agencies create strong and consistent rental demand. Landlords in Montgomery County generally have good pricing power, but the county's voluntary rent guidelines and active Office of Landlord-Tenant Affairs create a framework that encourages moderate, consistent increases rather than dramatic jumps. Prince George's County has a diverse rental market, ranging from high-demand areas near D.C. and the metro system to more affordable communities farther from the capital. The county has seen investment from Amazon's HQ2 presence in neighboring Arlington, Virginia, and from other development along the metro corridors. Rents have increased, and landlords in transit-accessible areas have strong pricing power. Baltimore City has a rental market with extreme variation between neighborhoods. Federal Hill, Fells Point, Canton, Mount Vernon, and the Inner Harbor area command premium rents, while many other neighborhoods face affordability challenges and higher vacancy rates. Baltimore landlords need neighborhood-level analysis to set appropriate rents and plan increases. The Baltimore suburbs, including Baltimore County, Harford County, and Carroll County, have more moderate markets with steady demand driven by suburban families and commuters. Howard County, home to the planned community of Columbia, has a strong rental market driven by excellent schools, proximity to both Baltimore and D.C., and major employers including the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Rents in Howard County are among the highest outside of Montgomery County. The military presence across Maryland significantly influences the rental market. Fort Meade, home to the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, is one of the largest employers in the state and drives substantial rental demand in the surrounding communities. The Naval Academy in Annapolis, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Andrews Air Force Base, and the Patuxent River Naval Air Station each create their own zones of military rental demand. Landlords near military installations should monitor BAH rate changes when planning increases. Annapolis, the state capital, has a unique market driven by state government, the Naval Academy, and tourism. The city's historic character and waterfront location command premium rents, and the market is competitive. The Eastern Shore and Western Maryland communities have more moderate and, in some cases, softer rental markets. Ocean City has a significant seasonal market driven by beach tourism, with very different pricing dynamics for year-round versus seasonal rentals. One critical best practice for Maryland landlords: identify the specific local requirements that apply to every property you own before implementing any rent increase. Maryland's county-by-county regulatory variation means that an approach that's perfectly legal in one jurisdiction may violate the rules in another. Contact the local Office of Landlord-Tenant Affairs or equivalent agency in each jurisdiction where you own property to verify the current requirements for notice periods, guideline percentages, filing obligations, and tenant disclosures. Another best practice: for landlords in Montgomery County, treat the voluntary rent guidelines as a practical ceiling, even though they're not legally mandatory. Exceeding the guidelines invites tenant complaints, mediation proceedings, and potential political attention that can be more costly and time-consuming than the additional revenue from a larger increase. Working within the guidelines while maintaining good documentation of your costs demonstrates reasonableness and protects you against challenges. For landlords who own properties in multiple Maryland jurisdictions, maintain separate procedures and notice templates for each jurisdiction. The notice requirements, guideline percentages, and filing obligations differ from county to county, and using a one-size-fits-all approach can result in compliance failures. Maryland also has specific requirements for manufactured home community lot rents that differ from standard residential tenancies. Landlords who own or manage manufactured home parks must follow specific notice and procedural requirements under Real Property Title 8A, including longer notice periods and additional content requirements. For Maryland landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority, typically the Housing Opportunities Commission in Montgomery County or the local authority in other jurisdictions. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable. In Montgomery County, The increase must also be consistent with the county's voluntary guidelines. Submit increase requests well in advance. Maryland requires landlords to return the security deposit within 45 days of the tenant vacating. The deposit must be held in a separate escrow account at a Maryland financial institution. If the landlord fails to return the deposit within 45 days, they may be liable for up to 3 times the amount wrongfully withheld, plus attorney's fees. Maryland limits the security deposit to 2 months' rent. For the complete guide to Maryland rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our series.